Okay, hi there. This is Paul J. Bennett, author of the Heir to the Crown series and the new series The Frozen Flame with Facebook Live. Sorry for the late start here. We had a few technical difficulties. I was originally going to talk today about historical movies and TV shows that I found particularly interesting. Unfortunately, the list of TV shows alone grew to be a little too large, so I'm going to split it. So I'll do movies another time. This time I'm going to talk about historical TV shows that I found to be quite interesting. Now, a note here, I am not assessing any of these for historical accuracy. Some of them are relatively accurate, others are completely out there in terms of what they're doing, pardon me, with the plot and so on. But there are certain things I'll mention for certain TV shows and so on. So to get things started, I've organized these shows by the year they started. Some of these went for quite a few years, and you'll find quite a mix in here between action, drama, and some comedy even in here, as well as some mystery shows which have a historical setting as well. Now this list could not possibly be complete. There are so many shows out there, and I'm sure I've missed a few, but these are the ones that I'm familiar with or that I've had an interest in watching or have watched. And so on. And I'm sure that there's other series out there that you would like as well. So going back to the days of my youth, probably the very first historical TV show I cut my teeth on was something called The Rat Patrol. So The Rat Patrol, we have a bunch of allied people in the desert rolling around with jeeps with 50 caliber machine guns, based on, of course, the Long Range Recon Division, which eventually became the SAS. So I watched this as a kid, loved it, couldn't wait for it to come on. Of course, back in those days, we couldn't record anything, so it was kind of hit and miss, but I really liked it. Moving forward a little bit, we have the first comedy on the list, Dad's Army, which goes way back to 1968. Now, for those who aren't familiar with this, Dad's Army is a comedy based on a group of individuals in the Home Guard. So the Home Guard we set up in World War II in Britain, and it was essentially soldiers who were too young or too old or infirm to serve in the regular army, and they were there to safeguard should the Germans invade. Series ran for a very long time. They even relaunched it a couple of times. Now this is the TV show. They did make a movie version in 2016 with Bill Nye, and not the science guy, the other Bill Nye, the British actor, along with Toby Jones and Catherine Zeta-Jones, which was mildly amusing. Moving out of the 60s, I don't remember a lot of the 60s. I was only born in 61, so usually, these shows like The Rat Patrol I saw mostly in reruns, to be honest. In 1971, we have a miniseries that aired, BBC, I believe it was BBC, anyways, British. It's called Elizabeth R., and it starred Glenda Jackson playing Queen Elizabeth I. And this is a miniseries. I remember watching it on Masterpiece Theater, which we got on the American PBS channels. Very, very gripping. I remember not knowing a lot about Elizabeth at the time, but I found the story to be quite fascinating, and her as a character was, she really grabbed the attention on the screen. 1972, another series I really enjoyed, Colditz. This had David McCallum. Some of you may know him from the NCIS series, and of course he was on The Man from U.N.C.L.E. He plays, Colditz is based on a true story about POWs in a German POW camp in World War II. And Colditz was a place where they took the worst offenders in terms of trying to escape, and Colditz was a castle that they were being kept in. So that's very much a drama type storyline. In 1979, this is a series that I'd almost forgotten about, and then when I saw it mentioned on this list I was looking at, I went, oh yeah, this was really interesting. It was a series called Danger UXB. So it was all about unexploded bomb disposal in England during World War II. Very gripping drama, a limited series. I forget how many episodes there were. Anthony Edwards, I believe, was in it. And it was very interesting because it starts early in the war when the bomb disposal people had next to no training, and it follows them through the war and how sophisticated things get and so on. And pretty grim in some cases. People get blown up, of course, and so on. Now, it was PBS. We're not talking like an HBO where you've got blood and guts and gore everywhere, but still very, very interesting. Moving on to 1983, one of my all-time favorite comedies, Blackadder, with Rowan Atkinson. Now, Blackadder is actually a series of series, if you like. The first story takes place in the, I believe it's the 1300s, and then they've got one in the Elizabethan age, another one in the Georgian age, and one more in World War I. Very entertaining. Oh, and if you're looking for something all equally as entertaining, try digging up A Blackadder Christmas Carol, which is quite hilarious. Moving on to some American ones. In 1985, there was an American series called North and South. Once again, one of these mini-series. It was so successful, they ran North, I believe they just called it North and South 2 and 3. And this is about a bunch of interconnected people during the American Civil War. Now, don't confuse this with the British North and South, which is a completely different story based on a novel. This North and South very much covers the war and how it splits families and separates them and so on. Very well acted. 1987 also saw Tour of Duty about Vietnam. This is kind of interesting because Vietnam was kind of a taboo subject, but around that time we have Platoon, the Oliver Stone movie Platoon came out. It inspired this TV show. For a network TV show, pretty gritty actually. I don't think it lasted long. It was a good attempt. I think something like that really belongs nowadays on something that has less censorship, like HBO, for example, or Stars or whatever, where they can be a little more graphic to portray the horrors of war. But they did a pretty good job of it. And they covered some pretty serious subject matters, drug addiction and so on. 1993, gotta mention Sharp, one of my all-time favorite TV shows, with the Sean Bean, of course. Now, I read all the Sharp books, at least the ones that were out at the time the show came out. This is another series that I found difficult to watch in the beginning because it only aired at weird times on the TV. Of course, now I have all the DVDs, so I can watch them when I want, and I have them all. Very, very entertaining. Some of you may remember in 2001 a really excellent miniseries called Band of Brothers, which follows men of the Airborne Division. I can't remember if it's 82nd or 101st. You'll have to pardon me for forgetting that part. Very good series. Very gritty. They followed up later on with another one. I believe it was called The Pacific. I could be wrong on the name there. I didn't come across it in my search. Unfortunately, search engines aren't perfect. So yeah, Band of Brothers, very well made. It's almost like watching them. Each episode is like watching a movie almost. Moving forward, 2002. This is a series I came across by accident. It's called Foyle's War. And it starts in World War II, but Foyle is a British detective inspector. And because he's a policeman, of course, he's not eligible to join the military, but he does have to solve wartime crimes, which makes it very, very interesting. I found the World War II parts were very interesting. For some reason, towards the end, they would make a series every 2 years, I think it was. Towards the end of the series, or the later seasons anyway, they skipped forward a whole bunch of time and took it out of the war, and then it became more about Russian spies and so on, and still interesting, but not as interesting. I missed that sort of wartime flavor to the series. 2008 is we have a Canadian series based in the Victorian and Edwardian time period called Murdoch Mysteries. So if you're familiar with CBC in Canada, Murdoch Mysteries airs there and many places around the world. This is a show that's still going strong. They've covered off more than 10 years, so it's not quite the same time period it used to be, but very entertaining. We still watch that. In fact, I've got an episode waiting for us to stream on the CBC app. So that's quite an interesting one, and it's got an interesting cast. And what we find with a lot of these shows is really the cast members that make or break the show, and that separates them. 2010, This was kind of a controversial one when it came out, Spartacus, which aired on the Stars Network. So first of all, let me start out by warning you, it's very graphic. And I mean graphic in terms of sexual content and violence. Both are a little overdone in the first couple of episodes, but once you get past the first 2 episodes, the storyline kicks in and it gets really interesting. Now, it starred, where are we here? Andy Whitfield. Unfortunately, after making the first season, he became ill and had to be replaced. So they did a backstory with the other characters, John Hannah and Lucy Lawless. Now, John Hannah, you may remember from the Mummy movies or Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., and Lucy Lawless, of course, is Xena. And so they were in charge of a gladiator training school. And, of course, Spartacus is about the slave rebellion. So that was a very interesting series. They did end up replacing the main actor, and it took a bit of adjustment to get used to him, but he did a pretty decent job. In 2010, we have a miniseries based on a Ken Follett book, who's a very well-known author, Pillars of the Earth. And this essentially takes place in one city or town, whatever you want to call it, set in the medieval period, as they attempt to build, or the events surrounding the building of a cathedral. They followed that up in 2012 with something called World Without End. None of the characters are carried over, but it's the same city, but a later period in time. And by the way, there's a lot of faces in Pillars of the Earth and in World Without End that you might recognize. Moving on to 2012, since I did mention World Without End, we have another sort of lighter entertainment, an Australian series called Miss Fisher's Murder Mysteries. This follows Phryne Fisher, who's essentially a flapper in the 20s, late 20s, and she lives in Australia. And so she's a what would be the word I'm looking for? Debutante, I guess would be the word. She's from a fairly well-to-do family in England. She moves to Australia and takes up the self-imposed career of detective. So that's very entertaining. And once again, it's the cast that makes that. Now, the series only runs for a couple of seasons, and then they've made a movie. I haven't been able to see the movie because it's not released on a network or streaming service that we have at present. There's also a new Miss Fishers that they've just announced that's airing, I think, on the British network. That's her niece, I think it is. It takes place in the 60s, but the original one takes place in the late 20s, I think early 30s. And it's got just enough of that flavor. And the setting in Australia, I think, was brilliant. It really gives it a different take. Much as Murdoch gives you the Toronto feel, this gives you the Australian feel as well. In 2013, another one of my favorites that also happens to be a detective show is Father Brown. Now, Father Brown has been done multiple times, but this is the one that stars Mark Williams. Now, Mark Williams, if you don't know, he played Arthur Weasley, the head of the Weasley clan in the Harry Potter movies, so that you would probably recognize him. Now, this Father Brown has been set in post-war Britain, which gives it an extra flavor, which makes it quite interesting. So it's 50s and 60s, depending on which episode you're looking at. But it's very well done and very, very engaging. And once again, it's the characters that make this a hit for me. Now we get into the 2010s and so on, and this is where things are going to get crowded because we have actually a lot of historical drama. A lot of these are not very historically accurate, but still entertaining. So once again, I'm not rating them based on their historical accuracy, but in 2013, we have the beginning of The Vikings. Okay, and so I'm still watching this. I'm only on the first season because I have too many shows to watch and not enough time to watch them. So far, I'm really liking it. If you just treat it as pure entertainment, don't worry about the history part of it. It's quite entertaining. It is a little grim in some cases, so I should warn you about that. Another show that we've started watching or rewatching, as was suggested by some people on Facebook, Black Sails. This is more of a pirate adventure. It's funny, the first time we watched it, it didn't really click, but then I realized watching it this time, one of the main actors is the guy from the from Lost in Space, from the Netflix series. So it's starting to grow on us. Once again, the problem is I got too many shows to watch. So I'll get back to it. Maybe that's a summertime thing. We'll have to wait and see. Because now I got too many shows on the go. I need to pick one and watch it. 2015. And in 2015, there was an Australian series. I believe it only went one season. We have it here on the CBC app. It's called Banished, and it's about convicts being sent to Australia during the early days of the settlement. Now, I thought this was quite interesting. Of course, I'd known about the convict settlement of Australia before, but this kind of gave a new perspective on things. I thought it was quite well done and interesting. Once again, I have no idea how accurate it is, but made for an interesting storyline. So that was good. 2015, one of my, same year that Banished came out, one of my favorite series based on one of my favorite authors, The Last Kingdom. So The Last Kingdom is based on the Bernard Cornwell Warlord Chronicles, which deal, or is that the right season? They've rebranded the books now. I think they just call them The Last Kingdom. And it's Uhtred of Babenberg, and the first series is based on the first two books. They call them series in England, so it's a little different. There are, I think, two or three seasons, and then they've moved over to Netflix. So there is another season coming. It'll be exclusive to Netflix. I imagine that will probably be the last season. But very, very interesting story. And it's kind of reminds me a little bit of Vikings, but in a bit of a, I want to say, smaller scale. It's just more interesting. It's more, the characters seem a little more interesting to me. Maybe that's because I've read the books, though. 2016 we're going to jump to now. And I've got two here, actually. One of these, we've just been started on the third season. Netflix has a series called The Crown. So these, if you really like the world of politics and the world and history of events and actual events, The Crown, very well done. Based on real events. I don't know how accurate it is in terms of history, but I do find that every time we watch a new episode, I'm looking stuff up on Wikipedia to find out more about what's going on. Very, very fascinating. We're partway through season 3, which just came out recently, and they're continuing with it. And the casting is really, really good. These people look and act like the actual people, at least from the historical records that we have. The same year, we have a series that came out with Jenna Coleman called Victoria. Only seen one season. I believe there's a second season. We don't have it on any of our streaming services at the moment. It's about the early life of Queen Victoria when she first takes the throne, as opposed to years later when, you know, the one we're used to seeing is the older Victoria that's always wearing black in mourning for her husband and so on. So the first season was very entertaining. It had a lot to do with her relationship with Prince Albert and how they tried to sideline him. And I thought that was very, very fascinating, especially watching The Crown, because in The Crown, when Queen Elizabeth first marries Prince Philip, well, she's not the queen at the time, but she marries Prince Philip, and there's the same sort of attempt to push him out of the limelight, and he has to struggle to find his place. So I thought that was very well done. Only two more I'm going to mention, because we are running a fair length here. In 2017, this is a show I found on the History Channel quite by chance. I saw a commercial for it. It's called Nightfall. Now, it purports to be all about the Knights Templar. This part of the history part is probably a little overdone. They're stretching it, but if you just take it as a pure fictional story, it's interesting. I like seeing knights running around in chainmail. It's got some interesting court intrigue. It's got some, I won't say salaciousness, but it's certainly has some interesting plot developments. It is on the History Channel, so it is relatively safe for consumption by people. You don't have to worry about, undue amounts of gore or sex or whatever. There is some, of course, but not overdone. Haven't seen the second season yet. I am excited to hear that apparently Mark Hamill is in the second season, so it'll be interesting to see what he has to add to it. Now, the last one I'm going to mention, this one I stumbled across. It's on Amazon Prime. I guess they're releasing the episodes one at a time. It's called Catherine the Great. and it's about the emperor, the Tsarina of the Russias, and probably the best thing going for this is Helen Mirren. She plays the Empress Catherine. Only seen one episode so far. I have to get back to watching that. It was very good, but at the time it was the only episode out so far, so haven't had a chance to go back and see more. So, like I said, there are lots of other shows on here. Oh, you know what? I think I missed one here because I seem to recall. Oh, yeah, I did forget two of them actually. Have to give a shout out to MASH, right? The surgical doctors in the Korean War. Amazing series, amazing cast. And actually, when they changed the cast up later on, I thought it got more interesting. They McLean Stevenson's character they killed off. He was the Henry Blake, the colonel of the group. They brought in Colonel Potter, which I thought added an interesting dynamic to the group. And of course, they played with replacing some of the other characters. Trapper John left. They brought in B.G. Honeycutt and so on. Very entertaining show. It also had one of the most watched finales of all time. I don't know if you've ever seen it or not. Definitely worthwhile seeing. The other one I forgot to add was Baa Baa Black Sheep. 1976. We have Robert Conrad as Pappy Boyington. Now, Pappy Boyington is an actual war hero. He fought with the Flying Tigers in China. Eventually, when America entered the war, he flew for the Americans. So this has him leading a squadron of Corsairs, fighter pilots, in their fight against the Japanese in the Pacific Theater. Once again, not necessarily historically accurate, but being a real fan of military hardware, this is a show I liked. You got to see the Corsairs in particular, but it had some interesting stuff. And it felt like a sort of a light version of some of those great movies that you see about fighter pilots and so on. So it was very entertaining. So that's about all I'm going to mention for now. That was a pretty long list. And as I said, there were lots more that came up during my research into this. But I can't mention them all. There's just too many. These are the ones that I remember that stick out for me. I'm sure there are others, and people will probably mention them, and I'll go, oh, yeah, I remember that. But these are the ones that came to mind as I was setting this up. On the home front here, we are just getting ready to release Embers. It's already up for pre-order, and Making of a Man has been out for some time now, and people are really enjoying it. Next broadcast in 2 weeks' time, I will finally get back to that list of historical movies. However, if there's too many, I may have to break it into 2 parts. So until next time, happy reading.